Lead funding for Working the Land was provided by Connecticut Farmland Trust, permanently protecting Connecticut's working farmland. Major funding was provided by Connecticut Farm Bureau, the voice of Connecticut agriculture. Additional funding was provided by Connecticut Department of Agriculture, dedicated to working with farmers to provide Connecticut residents with a safe, plentiful, and affordable food supply. Working the Land is a co-production of Simon Pure Productions and Connecticut Humanities Council, helping Connecticut residents explore the world's great stories.
We live in a state that was shaped from the very beginning by the demands of farming and the need to survive based on agricultural production. Connecticut's reputation was built on farming for the first 2 centuries of its life.
Even people that weren't farmers oftentimes were part-time farmers. Our heritage is firmly based in our agricultural past.
It's part of who we are. It's what supported and sustained us. It's what we think about, I believe, when we think about the character of this state and New England. But at the same time, it's not just history. It's a viable economic sector that's important to our economy today.
For all its rich history, Connecticut agriculture is at a crossroads, with a future that many say is at risk. Others see resurgence and transformation. What does the future hold for farming in Connecticut and the farmers who work its lands and waters? Native Americans planted crops here for centuries prior to European settlement.
Maize, Indian corn, is an amazing crop, not only in terms of its history, but its impact on Native people, colonists, and the world today, actually. And it all originated, as a tropical plant in Mesoamerica. Native women, over the centuries, began to manipulate that plant to adapt it to grow in different growing conditions, mature in 90 to 120 frost-free days. They were the plant scientists maintaining the fields, but men would also be involved in the initial clearing and preparing the land, and during harvest as well. The phrase three sisters usually refers to maize, beans, and squash. Those 3 crops are probably the most critical crops in native horticulture, and with good reason. Maize alone, beans alone, squash alone would not be able to support a population. That's when we begin to see a huge impact. Population skyrockets. We begin to see large villages develop. When the English began the migration out of Mass Bay and Plymouth Colony into Connecticut, they selected 2 areas, Connecticut River Valley and the coastal plain of Connecticut. And the reason for that was this is where the best agricultural soils were.
The fundamental requirement for people coming to this state, the first thing every settler had to do was provide for food for the future. John Winthrop Jr., who was a Connecticut governor, wrote a treatise on corn that he sent back to England. What he describes is a farming practice that now combines the efficiency of the plow with the production capacity and efficiency of native farming practices. They would plant squash and beans right around the corn hills. It was a perfect combination in terms of nutrition and also in terms of production efficiency. There was exchange and experiment and practicing going on.
Over time, native needs for lands for planting, hunting, and gathering clashed with the colonists' needs for agriculture.
I think the ultimate or underlying reasons for the conflicts with Native people and Europeans was land. Not only for differences in perception of ownership, but the bottom line is the English population was growing very rapidly. The rapidly growing population needs land. And within a generation or 2, you begin to see these conflicts develop between Native people and Native needs for agriculture and English people and English needs for agriculture.
The descendants of these colonists have been working the land of the state ever since. Their story is one of ingenuity, persistence, and accommodation. Tim Perry's family has been farming in Cheshire since colonial times.
When dairy prices really started falling off, we started getting more and more into the fruit and the wholesaling of fruit.
Norton Brothers recently moved their farm store from a small garage to a rebuilt dairy barn.
Our retail stand here is really taken off well. You know, certain things like peaches and nectarines, we're just getting into it. We need a little help from outside growers. It all comes in from probably almost 90% of it from a 10-mile radius. The customers that just keep driving in, you know, buying the stuff. They want local, they want Connecticut, they want farms. We've done weddings here, a lot of birthday parties, school tours. We do anniversary parties. If someone wants to rent out our place because they like the way it looks, then they can rent it out. I mean, it's called income.
The soils that sustained native and colonist remain productive today. Kip Kolosinskis is the U.S. Department of Agriculture state soil scientist.
We're here in the Connecticut River Valley, on the floodplain of the Connecticut River. These are some of the most valuable soils in Connecticut for agriculture and some of the most productive in the United States. These soils have some unique features. Every time the Connecticut River floods, it deposits a fresh layer of these silts and sands, which hold a lot of nutrients and also a lot of moisture, so you can grow about anything on them. It doesn't flood during the growing season, so you can plant a crop and get a crop out of it. We call them prime and important farmland soils. And they're of limited quantity statewide. And the Connecticut Valley has the highest concentration of prime farmland soils in the state.
Those rich soils made Connecticut Valley towns like East Hartford agricultural centers for centuries. Jim and Honora Futner are among the last to farm in East Hartford.
Back in the 1880s, Jim's great-grandfather and grandmother came over on their honeymoon from Italy, and they settled in Hartford at first, and then they decided to move out to the country, so they bought land in East Hartford. His sons started up a lot of the farming and started, was tobacco at first? All tobacco?
Lots of tobacco, broadleaf tobacco, assortment of winter squashes, potatoes.
Although Jim Futner's dad discouraged him from entering the family business, farming proved irresistible, even as increasing development diminished their farm.
When I graduated UConn in 1971, became partners with my father and uncle, and we farmed ever since then.
The Futners, with the occasional help of their children, still work 8 acres of the original family farm in East Hartford and 14 rented acres in South Windsor.
Wholesaling is a little tougher. You got to work a lot of volume, and we don't have the volume that we used to have when we had 50, 60 acres. We're up to about 25,000 square feet of greenhouse space, and the flower business has helped to keep the vegetable business going.
Successful farming over generations is tied partly to the richness of the land.
They love to curse the stones that are everywhere and argue that we're farming stony soils, but they've been very rich throughout history, especially those in the river bottoms. And the best ones were the ones that were cleared already because they were wet. That is, any place too wet to have forests grow. Those are the first ones settled and devoted principally to cultivation. One of the other most distinctive soil types are these upland soils that you'll see here in these drumlins. And a drumlin is a rounded, streamlined hill that forms when the material being carried along the base of the glacier is literally smeared across the bottom of the landscape. And what made them particularly attractive for pasture was that they hold moisture really, really well.
When the settlers arrived, they saw a landscape of forests and fields that had been managed by natives for thousands of years for agricultural purposes.
They saw a patchwork of fields and abandoned fields where secondary growth plants were coming up because the natives would abandon their cornfield after 2 or 3 years because they didn't apply fertilizers on a consistent basis. So they're still seeing sort of a quote-unquote natural landscape, but in their eyes, it was unmanaged. Native people weren't building edifices. They weren't fencing.
The settlers took over many unused native fields. Soon, their need for more agricultural land led to the thick forest.
Trees were cut over a period of time, but they let the stumps sit for a number of years. So it was a pretty ragged, rough-looking place for the first generation of the farms. But then as the stumps rotted away and as the stump fences were replaced by stone walls, gradually the landscape took on a fairly bucolic pastoral look, not totally unlike what we're seeing here today. So when you see fairly unkempt and not really well-assembled stone walls on the landscape, you're seeing the effort that it took to create a farm out of nothing.
Another ubiquitous symbol of our heritage is the town green. Today, many greens are ornamental parks. Once, the green marked the center of town and the centrality of agriculture.
The idea was it was public land and it could be used for whatever public purposes there were. Originally, town commons were like you see today at Lebanon, big open fields really where you could graze animals, particularly sheep and pigs. And there were actually officials in towns called hogreaves and haywards whose job was to regulate animals grazing on the commons. I think it was an important part of community identity because the center of town was not divorced from the agricultural countryside, and the common was an expression that it was an agricultural community.
During the Revolutionary War, Connecticut farmers supplied the emerging nation's army with most of its food, earning the state its nickname, the Provision State. One important commodity was salt hay grown in the marshes along coastal Connecticut.
All you had to do was cut it every year. You didn't have to plow or harrow, seed, nor fertilize. It was here. It was used by all the farmers or anyone that had a cow or two. You just could not survive without it. And it's called the Continental Marshes because during the Revolutionary War, the farmers were all provision farms around here. And we used to come down, my ancestors did, and mow this marsh by hand with a scythe, and rake it up by hand, and it was hauled up to the farm and stacked. And when Washington supply trains came through from New York to Boston or going the other way, they had a campground out here in Center Groton. And the scouts would go ahead and notify the farms that they needed fodder, corn and hay for 100 oxen.
Whit Davis is the owner of the farm established in the mid-1600s by Thomas Stanton, the Interpreter General for the New England colonies.
I'm 81 years old, and I worked here on the farm ever since I was able to walk 7 days a week. I'm the last commercial salt hay harvester in Connecticut. We used to grow dairy and beef cattle here, and we had our work teams of horses and sheep. But we've gone out of the livestock business because if it doesn't pay, it doesn't stay.
Not far from the Stanton Davis farm is the Joshua Hempstead house in New London. Hempstead was a judge, surveyor, carpenter, and stonecutter who also farmed property in 3 nearby towns. The developing world economy proved profitable for many of Connecticut's early farmers like Hempstead, who shipped farm product to Caribbean sugar plantations.
The trade to the West Indies dominated the Connecticut economy for over 200 years, really. The first ships that left Connecticut for Barbados were loaded with produce in the 1650s. Livestock was the principal commodity out of Connecticut. In the late 1790s, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 head of cattle and horses, mules, were being sent to the West Indies out of the port of New London alone. And that was just 1 year out of many, many years of this important trade. Similar vessels and similar commodities were sailing out of every port in Connecticut. Connecticut supplied the plantation system, essentially. A lot of these animals were used in raising sugarcane, which was the principal product out of many of the West Indian islands. It was sustained by a slave economy. Connecticut sent just prodigious quantities of pressed hay, barrels of pork and beef, onions, all sorts of vegetables, cider, butter, and cheese to the West Indies.
By the 1750s, the soil was worn out in many parts of Connecticut. So when Killingworth pastor Jared Elliott wrote Notes on Husbandry, the first book on farming techniques published in the colonies, his essays became famous and his advice widely adopted.
He suggested a lot of things like gathering up seashells and burying them for a year and then exhuming them and spreading it over your fields to lime the fields. And there were all kinds of advice about liming and manuring and so forth. So Connecticut farmers have always been attuned to technological developments that would increase their productivity.
For people who had land, who owned land, this was a great place to be a farmer in the 1800s. The problem was that people in Connecticut, like people elsewhere in New England, took the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply seriously, so they had a lot of kids. And for many of these children, it was clear that there was not going to be enough land in Connecticut for them.
If land was a little cheaper somewhere else, people were going to move. If land was a little better somewhere else, people were going to move. And the first migration out of Connecticut were to the towns in New Hampshire and Vermont. Then when New York State, upper New York State, became open for settlement, a lot of people moved there. Then, of course, the next step are the lands of the Midwest. By 1820 or so, this was a constant theme, people bemoaning the movement out of Connecticut, people moving to better farmland, people moving into other aspects of the economy, into the cities, into industry.
In the 1800s, nearly everyone was a farmer, and agriculture was the primary economic activity. Research and scientific methods were adopted to improve farming. While some Connecticut farmers in the 19th century were involved in world trade, others struggled on small-scale subsistence family farms that depended on hard work and adaptability to survive.
Every farm family tried to have something that they could sell. If they were close to a city or if they were close to a rail line, they might have some cash product in the form of vegetables. Increasingly, as the 19th century went on, there was marketing of cream through the railroad network.
Milk was not sold as fluid milk, it was sold as butter. The milk would be placed in 40-quart cans. It would be put into a kind of running water, like a spring cooler, and kept cool and then brought to the creamery, and they would make butter, and that was the product that they had for sale.
Don Tuller is the 7th generation of his family to operate Tull Meadow Farm in Simsbury since 1768.
The reason that Tull Meadow Farm is still in existence is because of our ability to change as we needed to change. In 1983, we decided that we were a 75-cow dairy, that we either needed to get bigger or do something different. So we planted a large garden that year and just started some self-service direct marketing. We put out a table and had tomatoes and sweet corn on it. From there, the farm store has evolved. We started making ice cream in 1994. That has grown to be the biggest part of our business. We see approximately 90,000 customers a season for ice cream. Agriculture is a business. And how many businesses are doing things exactly the same way they did? I mean, very few can. I'm thankful that we are in an area where we're close to a busy street. We're in an affluent suburban community. Location is critical.
The suburbanization that supports Tull Meadow Farms has more often taken farmland for development. To the Greenbacker family, who had farmed the same land in Wallingford since 1723, staying in farming meant leaving their ancestral land. In the early 1980s, the family decided to sell their farm for development into a corporate headquarters. With the proceeds from that sale, they bought an existing dairy farm in Durham.
We were surrounded by development there, didn't really have enough land to support our animals and keep our operation going. This farm, the owner had previously sold the development rights to the state of Connecticut. So we purchased this farm in 1983. I basically do field work and feed the cows. Melissa takes care of the cows. Joe does a lot of everything. I do most all the repairs on the farm. Besides us three, my wife Lois does a lot of the milking. Other family members help out.
Like many surviving dairy farmers, the Greenbackers run a diversified agricultural business.
Our biggest operation is the dairy farm. It's quite a challenge to keep that going. Since we've been running the farm, we've at least broke even or made money. But we also have a lot of expenses, and they add up quick.
Joe's daughter Melissa is the latest generation to work the farm.
I grew up on the farm and always helped out from whenever I was little. I remember going out to the barn with my dad and milking and riding on the tractors and and even being in the playpen near the barn all the time. It's a type of service that we're providing, food and nourishment for people, and I feel that that's a worthy thing to continue to do.
A farm is a good place to live, it's a good place to raise children, and it's a good place to grow old also. Because you don't really have to retire, you just kind of slow down gradually.
Connecticut's landscape and economy changed drastically in the mid-1800s with the onset of industrialization. The rise of the cities surprisingly proved a boon to farmers.
Virtually every Connecticut city had one or more points in the 19th century where within a 20-year period their population doubled in size. And the engine of that growth, of course, was industrialization and the jobs that were created by industrialization. So in addition to sustaining the worker population in the cities, in a sense, helped to sustain the countryside as well because they were providing a market for surplus agricultural goods.
In increasing numbers, farmers left the farm to take these new jobs. At the same time, tasks once done by hand and now mechanized meant fewer farmers could produce more product. By the end of the 19th century, there were all kinds of horse-drawn mechanisms to assist in farm work. After World War II, farmers greatly increased production with the help of engine-based mechanization such as tractors. In the 19th century, orchard crops were among the farm products most in demand in the state. Orchards became big business with one farmer, known as the Peach King, leading the way.
J.H. Hale from Glastonbury kind of introduced peach growing to the state and convinced a whole bunch of crazy people that peaches could be grown in Connecticut. And so we were one of them back in the 1890s, and that was our first commercial crop. We had, at the turn of the century, 500 acres of peaches. And Connecticut was the second largest peach producing state behind Georgia until the winter of 1917-18, where frost went 4 feet in the ground and basically killed every peach tree in the state. Most peach growers at that time shifted over, including ourselves, to apple growing, or apple trees, which were more hardy. And so we got into the apple business pretty seriously.
For more than 100 years, the proximity of markets has shaped the face of Connecticut agriculture. Lyman's orchards grew from 30 acres in 1741 to hundreds of acres today.
We incorporated in 1949, and from that point until today, now we're at 175 family shareholders. Today, Lyman Orchards is a very diversified business. We're basically in the orchard business. In the late 60s, Pick Your Own was, I think, our first foray into what I would call agritourism, and that has become a very big piece for us. The wholesale markets have changed dramatically, and to survive, we've had to become more direct marketers. We're still in the best market in the world. It's a highly populated state, which means it's got its challenges, but we have our customers right here.
When Connecticut Governor Wilbur Cross posed on a turkey farm in the 1930s, it was a photo opportunity designed to appeal to farmers and rural voters who continued to dominate the state legislature.
At the same time as farmers and these new industrialists are both benefiting and growing in this new economy of the early 19th century, there's an active political change that in the long run is going to give farmers a very disproportionate influence on the state legislature, something that continued all the way to 1965. It came about as a result of the Constitution of 1818. What they said in the new Constitution was this: if you are an existing town in Connecticut, you can send 2 representatives to the General Assembly. Any new town that comes after 1818 will be able to send 1. You have this situation where rapidly urbanizing and industrializing cities have half the representation of a little town like Union. And that created a very conservative rural orientation in the Connecticut Assembly that it maintained really well into the 20th century.
The need to get product to out-of-town markets is why influential farming interests lobbied hard for improvement to the state's road system in the early 1900s.
The whole state highway system of Connecticut was primarily brought about by the agitation of organized farm interests. You can't be market-oriented if all you have is this muddy road that's barely passable half the year. The so-called good roads movement really led to the state taking responsibility for the road network, and that was purely get the stuff from the farm to the railroad station so that you could export it.
When the railroads come in, you have refrigerated cars that also come along after a while, and this changes agriculture appreciably because food can be shipped from one area to another, and areas can begin to specialize. And with all of this technology, it took fewer and fewer people to do the work on the farm, and the farms could also get larger.
Technology, transportation, and regional commodity specialization defined 20th century agriculture. These trends favored larger farms that shipped food ever greater distances to market. Many state family farmers, especially poultry and dairy operators, couldn't compete with the large food processors and stopped farming, often selling their land to developers. Former state legislator Jack Tiffany is the fifth-generation owner of Tiffany Farms, founded in 1841.
Each day brings a new challenge and something different. That's, I think, what keeps a lot of farmers going. When I was a kid, there was probably 15, 18 dairy farms in the town of Lyme. Today, we're the only dairy farm left, and we're producing more milk than those 15 or 18 farms did by far more milk. But you gotta ask whether the town is better off. We were milking by hand in 1940. Now there's these tremendous parlors. Right after World War II, they went to the bulk tanks, and that really separated the men from the boys. A lot of farmers refused to make that investment and decided that they would hang it up. Just been tremendous change, and whether you like it or not, I suspect this change is gonna accelerate, and that is kind of scary. I don't think there's a handful of dairy farms in the state of Connecticut that are making money. There's a few that are breaking even, and there's a bunch that are losing money. I've got a son and a daughter here. They're into purebreds, and that's been part of our salvation. We're selling embryos overseas now, higher-priced animals.
Connecticut has long supported science and technology in service of agriculture. In 1875, the Connecticut General Assembly established the first state agricultural experiment station in the country. Today, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station in New Haven focuses on food safety, plant growth and analysis, pest control, and soil and water quality.
In the late 1800s, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station assisted farmers mainly by analyzing fertilizer to make sure that the product contained the materials that were supposed to be in there. So it was really, in a way, the early formation of consumer protection. We have several major achievements here at the experiment station. The invention of the double-cross hybrid method, where greater productivity per acre of corn was a magnificent discovery that had impact throughout the world. We work very closely with the agricultural community and do a lot of our work right in their own fields. 50% of our program here is dedicated in one way or another to analyzing crops for disease problems, solving insect problems, analyzing foods that are produced, in our Connecticut farms. One of our major programs is to find ways of reducing pesticide use in farm operations. We also test new crops. There are many more minorities now. They demand certain crops, and we have a research program to evaluate some of these crops that have never been grown here before.
Another institution founded in the late 1800s to support state farming was the Storrs Agricultural School, which was conceived at an 1880 farmers' convention in New Britain. In 1881, the General Assembly established the school on land donated by the Storrs brothers. 13 farm boys enrolled that first year. Women were first admitted in 1893. In 1933, Governor Wilbur Cross signed a bill designating the school as the Connecticut State College. In 1939, it became the University of Connecticut. For decades, UConn's College of Agriculture curriculum emphasized educating the children of farm families who would return to the farm. Today, that curriculum has had to change with the times.
We do not have many students that come to this college for an education to go back to a farm. The big areas of interest for our students are human nutrition, as dietitians, as researchers, as faculty in institutions, as corporate workers in the food industry.
UConn's connection to agriculture goes beyond student education. The college manages the state cooperative extension system, established in 1914 by the federal government for the advancement of farming and well-being of farm families.
Cooperative extension agents were trained to help farmers carry out their enterprise and do it by using the best known research information at the time. Along with that came the youth development program, the 4-H program that we still operate. After World War II, cooperative extension's programming expanded to be involved in community development, family-related issues, adult education in the inner cities and in the urban settings, in addition to the agricultural settings.
The close historic relationship between UConn and Connecticut agriculture can best be seen in how it helped the state's poultry industry to develop.
In the 50s and 60s, really, poultry was the major agricultural industry here in Connecticut. We had the egg-laying business, and we also had a broiler business. There were small family farms. Well, many of them were started by immigrants.
UConn researchers helped farmers find the best breeder stock for egg production with an extensive testing program.
The producers that had the best birds were the ones that were selling the birds to the public for the next year. Later on, we had broiler tests to find out which broilers are good. And that's how our acres started.
When Italian immigrant Frank Saglio left his job in 1926 as foreman of J.H. Hale's peach business, he called his new Glastonbury fruit and vegetable farm Arbor Acres. Frank's youngest son, Henry, loved to tend his family's small flock of chickens. Over time, with help from cooperative extension, Henry Saglio turned his passion into a successful chicken breeding operation. In 1948, Saglio won a nationwide contest sponsored by A&P supermarkets to find the best broiler breeding stock. That win laid the groundwork for Connecticut's largest agricultural business ever, with sales of $100 million a year. For more than 40 years, Arbor Acres sold as much as 80% of the world's broiler breeding stock. In 1999, Arbor Acres merged with the company that eventually moved to the south, citing the higher costs of doing business in the state. It would not be the last time that economic imperatives and regional competition would result in the loss of a huge Connecticut agriculture business. 20th century advances in farming efficiency and productivity eventually led to larger farm operations and the loss of small family farms. The state's poultry industry was transformed through consolidation as thousands of farmers went out of business by the 1980s.
The poultry industry in Connecticut since 1900 has evolved from about 4,000 poultry farms to fewer than 25 actual locations where poultry are being raised commercially. Over that time, we've seen it evolve also from a floor-raised operation to a cage operation starting in the late 50s, early 60s. The number of birds in the state, however, has remained fairly constant. 3.5 to 4 million laying hens in the state is about where we've been in the last 50 years, but consolidation into facilities. To the point today, there's really one major egg producer in the state, and that's Cough Cough Egg Farms, which is also part of a larger U.S. company called Moark with 4 million hens. We can produce 100% of the eggs for the state of Connecticut. We actually export some eggs.
Sam Waterston was one of thousands of Jewish urban residents who came to Connecticut in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to start farming. These new farmers were helped by a philanthropic organization whose mission was to give Jewish immigrants a way out of the crowded urban tenements of the day. Settling mostly on worn-out Yankee farms with rocky soil unsuitable for crops, they started dairy and egg farms and producer cooperatives, many of which thrived for several generations, helping to revitalize Connecticut agriculture. In the early 1900s, the European migration that filled Connecticut cities also transformed the countryside.
Those farms, which were extremely marginalized, were really given new life by the immigrants from Europe. They really sustained Connecticut agriculture for many years. I would say from 1900 to really the World War II period. Oftentimes there was a sort of specialization. I mean, you can go down here in Hebron and Glastonbury and find fruit farms that Italian-American families were particularly active in giving new life to. In Ashford, tremendous number of Slovaks. In parts of Hartford County, we find a lot of Polish farmers settling, becoming involved in raising potatoes and other crops.
African Americans played an important role in Connecticut agriculture from the very start.
Certainly, there was large-scale, first slave-based and then tenant farmer-based agriculture in parts of the state. But equally typical would be just African Americans who had maybe smaller holdings than their white Yankee neighbors, but they would be undertaking the same sort of agricultural life as well, either as small independent proprietors of farms or as farm laborers on other farms.
Perhaps the most distinctive state agricultural crop is tobacco, used as cigar wrappers. With the successful introduction of shade tobacco in 1901, came a need for thousands of seasonal workers. Connecticut growers met the demand over the years by hiring immigrants, Southern African Americans, and migrant contract workers in addition to local residents. In the 1950s and 60s, thousands of Puerto Rican workers were recruited to fill a labor shortage on the farms. The long hours and Spartan worker camps attracted the attention of unions, church groups, and political activists who successfully pushed for better conditions. Starting in the 1970s, tobacco farmers increasingly sold their farms for development. Today, Connecticut tobacco farms occupy about 4,000 acres, down from a peak of 30,000 in the 1920s.
My grandfather came from Poland, ended up buying the farm with his cousin, which was the home farm where I grew up. All around the world, they're growing tobacco, and tobacco is similar to ours, but they still can't get quite the same quality and taste. Otherwise, they could grow this tobacco anywhere around the world much cheaper than we can in Connecticut. Our labor rates are higher, our land costs are higher, our fixed costs are higher. In the summertime, during harvest season, there's about 125 employees. When I was a kid growing up, there were a lot of new houses and there were a lot of kids that worked on the farms in the summertime. As the economy's gotten better, now Enfield's developed into more of a sort of a retail area. Kids are working in grocery stores or the malls, or they're tied up with school programs. We've had more guys coming from Springfield, Hartford area, our local workforce that drives in on a daily basis. Predominantly, they're of Puerto Rican descent. We get some guys that are of Mexican descent, some from the Dominican Republic. We also get some guys every summer that come from Jamaica.
Although thousands of Connecticut residents work year-round on state farms, many seasonal jobs are filled by migrant laborers.
We're highly labor-intensive. We have seasonal workers. They work in Florida in the winter months, then move up this way during the summer months, and they work here. We don't really recruit. They just come here.
Luigi Borelli started farming in East Haven in 1925. In 1940, his son Anthony bought additional land nearby in order to expand the family business.
He was a grower shipper. He used to grow a little bit, buy from a lot of small area farms here. And my uncles and my father farmed together for quite a few years. And then when they all retired, we took it over. It's strictly agricultural production, that's it. Strictly wholesale. Right now we have a Stop and Shop, Big Y, and Shaw's. We're always changing. Some of the crops we're raising now we never even heard of 20 years ago. We raise what our customers are looking for, primarily. Appearance means a lot today. As long as it's got shelf life and lasts good, that's it. There's no seasons anymore for anything. I mean, some days are gone. They're in the supermarket 365 days a year now. I mean, it's raised in Canada, Mexico. Greenhouse crops come from all over the world.
The Borelli farm is surrounded by encroaching residential development.
I get asked the same question every day, when you're going to sell out, you know? When you're going to sell the land and take it easy. I said, probably won't. As of now, you never know. Well, we've just been doing it so long, it's just hard to think of doing something else. Right where we're standing now, if we step back a couple of feet, there's 3 building lots here. Tomorrow, I probably get $175,000 a piece for one call. You know, not that we don't return the calls, we're just not interested in it. I got 3 boys, but none of them are on the farm. My brother's got a couple of kids, none of them are on the farm. As long as me and my 2 brothers are in good health, we'll probably keep doing it. If something happens to one of us, then it changed the whole picture. They're probably looking at the last generation of early farmers.
Perhaps the greatest challenge to agriculture in Connecticut is suburbanization and its unending need for land to develop. In the last half of the 20th century, changes in transportation, new jobs outside the cities, and a desire for country living all helped to create a great demand for farmland. In 1947, there were 22,000 farms in the state. Today, there are about 4,200.
Route 84 went right through the middle of my grandfather's farm. Maybe 40 acres of farmland was taken, split in half, so we had to cross the highway. I can still remember my uncle taking the tractor and just driving across Route 15 or 84 as it is today.
The loss of land was accompanied by increased traffic, which at first helped boost farm income for the Futner's farm store.
When we first started on Silver Lane, there were several stands, roadside stands, growing vegetables. Probably because Pratt & Whitney has been downsized, the traffic has lessened quite a bit, and the stands have gradually dwindled down to just us on Silver Lane and East Hartford.
As an older inner ring suburb, East Hartford's farmland has almost entirely disappeared due to development. That trend still continues.
When we thought we had a chance of saving the land across the street that we've rented for 36 years, we put out a sign-up list for people to just express their interest because we knew that it was going to affect people deeply. So when we had the sign-up list, people took it for a petition. People were passionate about it, everybody that came in.
The first homes have been completed at Phillips Farm, now a housing development. The sales outlook for the 67 projected units is promising. The Futners have lost 17 acres of production. It is ironic that we honor our farming heritage by often naming development projects after the farm they replaced.
Hear the creaking of a farmer's rake as he's gathering the hay from a meadow by a woodline where we used to play. And a robin wants to build her nest where the ivy's overgrown as another day's greeting our New England home. Oh, the fire in the evening, feel the warm red glow.
The loss of farmland to development is the key threat to the future of farming in the state. Yet, Connecticut agriculture is still a very visible part of the state's landscape, culture, and economy. Connecticut's remaining farms occupy about 360,000 acres, 11% of the state. 50,000 people work in agricultural-related businesses, which contribute about $2 billion a year to the state economy. Farms worked by the same family going back generations are joined by a new breed of farmer, from small-scale part-timer to multi-million-dollar operator.
We're very diverse. We have some very large farms, and we have some very, very small farms. There are farms that are very, very successful in the state, and there's some farms that are struggling. Legislatively, more money is being devoted to agriculture, more monies for farmland preservation, more monies for marketing of Connecticut grown. We have challenges ahead with labor and cost of production and preserving farmland, but overall, Connecticut agriculture is in a growth spurt at this moment.
The sprawl that has taken farmland has helped the horticulture industry. The production and sale of flowers and plants is the largest segment of Connecticut agriculture, with about 100 wholesale growers, 900 retailers, and 500 landscapers in the state.
There is a tremendous correlation with the housing boom and the real estate boom that has happened in our country and my business. There are many beautiful homes being built in Connecticut that need beautiful landscapes. We're one of the top 2 or 3 largest nurseries in the Northeast. We grow in excess and sell in excess of over 3 million plants a year, almost close to $30 million in wholesale sales a year. We are a form of agriculture that's kind of unique, and some people might not think of this as a form of agriculture, but we grow plants that people don't eat. All of our plants are grown in containers, but they're living plants. We have to deal with the weather, and that we are still out here composting, creating a soil, watering, irrigating. We are very fortunate to be located where we are. We are in an agricultural area of Connecticut, Lebanon, with a great agricultural heritage, and also close to an old industrial mill town, Willimantic, that has a large Hispanic population. We have a workforce that's predominantly Hispanic. We are very close to our markets, and that is a key competitive edge. You can grow all these plants that you see here a lot cheaper and a lot quicker in Florida, California, North Carolina. But what those growers can't do is guarantee that we can ship that product every week during the peak selling periods of spring.
Sprawl also increases traffic, ironically creating opportunities for those farms that have managed to survive, if they can figure out how to exploit the change.
Bishop's Orchards is a family farm operation that was started in the present location in 1871 in Guilford. One of the things that has enabled our farm to do better and be productive is the advent of I-95 was put through the Connecticut Turnpike in the mid-50s. That took away 7 acres of our family's farm operation by eminent domain. The family then procured another 140 acres with some of that money to add additional cropland to our farm. So US Route 1 and I-95 have served combined together to bring traffic to us and enabled us to grow our operation from a 2-family farm operation into Guilford's 3rd largest employer. Most of the labor that we have here on our farm centers around the farm market, packing and preparing things for the farm market, as well as the harvest of those fruits out in the farm and the ongoing taking care of the crops. Our farm market is the mainstay of our operation to sell the products we grow as well as other products. The Connecticut Grown program, getting native produce, is really important to our business.
This is News Channel 8 at 6.
Darren, thank you. Hard times are falling on a nationally known agricultural business in our state. Franklin Farms is suspending its mushroom growing and harvesting business, resulting in hundreds of layoffs. The farm is located in North Franklin.
Although many farms find profits through retail sales, large production farms that wholesale food operate in an often challenging business environment. When Franklin Mushroom Farm shut down their growing operation in 2006, the owner of the $42 million business cited high energy costs, labor availability, transportation difficulties, and inadequate agricultural support services in the area. Pinchbeck's Rose Farm in Guilford is an example of how energy costs can make or break a farm business. In 1929, Pinchbeck's founders built the largest greenhouse in the country to service the New York and Boston wholesale flower markets. At one time, Pinchbeck's burned about 200,000 gallons of oil per year.
Our main competition now is from overseas, specifically Ecuador and Colombia. Our second largest cost is heating, and in Ecuador they have very low heating, if any heating costs, and their labor is very cheap. To grow roses on Valentine's Day, you need a good heating system. Trying to maintain 64 degrees at night when you've got a blizzard out on February 13th. And my dad did 2 things. He bought some big tanks to store a lot of oil, and he also looked into the possibilities of burning an alternative fuel. And that eventually led to his decision to go with getting into burning waste wood, and we have 2 large boilers that heat it. A ton of wood is equivalent to a barrel of oil, and we're paying $12 a ton for wood, and oil just peaked at $70 a barrel. And it really is the key factor that's been able to keep us going here where we are, because our heating costs have been drastically reduced.
From colonial times, disease, pests, and the weather have challenged Connecticut farmers. State aquaculture, farming underwater, has been seriously affected in recent years by a killer parasite.
In the 1890s to the early 1900s, we had peak oyster harvests. We had at one time over 350 boats in New Haven that were actually harvesting oysters or cultivating oysters. Milford was also a center. In the 1940s and 50s, the oyster population really declined due to overfishing, pollution, and we really haven't had that high peak as we saw in the 1890s since.
The oyster industry was decimated by disease in the mid-1990s, causing sales to drop to about $1 million a year.
In the mid-90s, before the oyster disease problem, we had a peak greater than $60 million in revenues from oysters alone. The state has put a lot of time and money into investigating disease-resistant strains, and we're looking for a rebound.
Responding to adversity by adapting to changing conditions is a key to survival in farming. To cope with the drastically reduced oyster population, oysterman Jim Marco started a cooperative hatchery with other growers in 2004. They grow about 4 million oyster seedlings a year for the partners.
We needed to start growing more than we were intending on taking, because we have a lot of problems with predators and weather and things like that. So our attrition through what we plant is pretty severe. We don't rely on natural set at all. So it's a lot more secure situation.
Marco also changed the way he harvested oysters in order to cope with the adverse conditions.
What we felt was that we needed to have our inventory on hand all the time. So we started with the cage system here, where we keep our inventory out in the sound in an area that's certified. So if we get an order, we're able to run out, pull an order, and have it packed and out to the distributor within 2 hours, an hour after it's come out of the water. So I think what we need to do is just keep expanding on our successes.
The most endangered sector of state farming is the dairy business. Federal regulations that limit wholesale prices, coupled with rising land values, have resulted in a huge decrease in the number of state dairy farms. Graywall Farms, started in 1989, is a notable success story in the otherwise startling decline of the sector.
Farms in other part of the country, in certain parts they have a lot more land that they can acquire. They can grow their cow numbers and they can grow their businesses. In Connecticut, we don't have that luxury of the available land base. We need to be as efficient as we possibly can.
Graywall Farms co-founded a marketing cooperative in 2005 to capitalize on the demand for locally produced food.
We have 6 farms from eastern Connecticut that have gotten together to market milk under the label of the farmer's cow. So we can take advantage of that huge consumer base that's right at our doorstep. The marketplace between Boston and New York is one of the largest consumer markets in the world. We found it to be extremely enthusiastic response to our initiative to market milk. The advantage we have is we're the source. You can come to the farm and you can see where and how your milk is produced.
About 20% of the state's dairy farms have diversified their operations. Cato Corner Farm makes popular artisanal cheeses.
We use only the milk from our own cows to make our cheese. That's a very important thing for 2 reasons. One, it's a truly local agriculture, which is something that's very important to me because it has to do with preservation of the land base and the food base. And second, it's the character of the product. It has a distinct taste.
It's exciting in the cheese making to start the day with liquid milk, and within a few hours you've seen curd that's on its way to becoming cheese. And it's very different already by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and In 2-3 months, it's taken its own individual turn. We've tried to eliminate the middleman as much as possible and take it directly to consumers. So we sell a lot at farmers markets, and we're realizing that there's quite a wholesale demand as well that we can fill.
Developing specialty products has helped some state farmers to maintain their bottom line. Maple Lane Farm started in 1978 as a pick-your-own fruit farm.
Things change over the years. We're kind of evolving a little away from the pick-your-own business, more into the processing of the blackcurrant juice. We're the first to produce a fresh blackcurrant juice in this country, and we are distributing that all throughout the Northeast at this time. And we are now the largest grower of blackcurrants in the country, and we are planting every year more and more acres. We have our own bottling operation, so we can do our fresh juice year-round at our farm. It could be a nationwide product before too long.
Processing farm products to add value and selling directly to the consumer can also help to boost revenues.
I want to make more profit, so I create value-added products. And when the tomatoes are splitting because we don't control the weather, what do? I make tomato sauce. So now I went from throwing the tomato away to creating a jar that's worth $4.95. So I can do that. The dairy, they can't do that.
She can change the price on her apples anytime she wants, whereas we cannot change the price on our milk.
The Freunds have developed sustainable planting pots made from cow manure.
We take the manure and we put it into a form that is easily to handle, it doesn't have an odor, and makes a bigger, faster, stronger plant. It outperforms pea pots, which is the industry standard for a non-plastic pot that you can plant in the ground. That's it. So we have the technology, we have the recipe, we have the product. Now we have to figure out how to get it to the people.
At one time, farm fresh often meant home delivery of milk, eggs, and produce. With the convenience of supermarkets and high fuel prices, only 2 state dairies still manage to maintain a home delivery route. But other ways to get farm fresh food directly from state farms are becoming increasingly popular. Around the state, there are more than 200 farm-based retail outlets, from tiny part-time farm stands to supermarket-sized stores, where farmers sell their products as well as those of nearby farms. There is also a growing demand for local product in traditional outlets like grocery stores, hotels, conference centers, and restaurants. Academic institutions more often are buying directly from local growers. At Yale's Berkeley College Dining Hall, for example, students enjoy a diverse menu derived whenever possible from local and organic suppliers. As part of the state's new Farm to School program, 51 public schools and school systems are buying some of their produce directly from state farmers rather than corporate distributors. Also growing in popularity are farmers markets. This year, there are a record 81 farmers markets in the state. In the mid-1980s, there were just 20.
Farmers markets are pretty spread across the board demographically and economically. We run a program called WIC, which is Women, Infant, and Children Nutritionally at Risk, where we give young moms and kids vouchers, and they can redeem them for Connecticut-grown fruits and vegetables at farmers markets. And it's really opened up a lot of markets in some very urban areas.
Hey there, we're the Panini Brothers. Welcome to City Farmers Market, Worcester Square, New Haven, Connecticut. That's the Elm City, baby.
The mission of City Seed is to engage the community in growing a sustainable local food system that promotes community development, economic development, and sustainable agriculture. We require that every market be a grower-only market. So you know when you're the customer that you're buying directly from the farmer, and they can sell their products at retail prices. I think that when you come to a farmer's market and you buy a tomato in season and you eat it, it's a completely different experience. And I think once you have that experience, you suddenly start to realize that all of these wonderful things can happen if you only would eat seasonally and eat locally. You can support local farms, your food is going to taste better, it's better for you because the nutritional content is higher the sooner you eat it after it was harvested. There are all of these wonderful things that begin to happen by eating that better tasting tomato.
The appeal of farm fresh food and the beauty of Connecticut's rural landscape have always drawn visitors to state farms. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, city dwellers came by train, buggy, or boat to visit their farming relatives in places like Moodus and the Litchfield Hills. Word spread, and eventually many farmers established knotty-pined resorts. The success of these resorts, ranging from rustic campgrounds to full-service vacation destinations, made Moodus the resort capital of Connecticut for much of the 20th century. Today, visiting a farm-based destination is called agritourism. It is a way for state farmers to increase income and lengthen their seasons. 300 state farms are open to visitors who can buy products, harvest their own crops, and take tours. Some farms offer unique experiences and demonstrations for both children and adults, ranging from historical agricultural museums to close encounters with a buffalo herd. As fewer of us live on or next to a farm, as the countryside becomes suburbanized, those farms that welcome visitors offer an opportunity to reconnect with our heritage, to get back to the land while supporting local agriculture.
I think all of us in Connecticut really cherish the farmland that's remaining. But really, to survive, agriculture has got to be more than scenery. It's got to be economically viable, too. We've got to make sure that the farmers have all they need. It can't just be a theme park that we drive through. Agriculture's got to have a real economic reason for being.
One of Connecticut's oldest agritourism destinations is Shelton's Jones Family Farm, which draws visitors from Connecticut and New York. The Jones Farm history demonstrates the skillfulness with which Connecticut's farmers have changed with the times.
The Jones Family Farm had its beginnings in 1848 with the journey of my great-great-grandfather Philip over from Ireland. He became very seasick, decided to stay, and he put together the family farm. It was a general farm with beef cattle and orchards. He would take his product down to the city of Derby and market it directly to customers. Then his son, William, began the dairy farm, which continued actually right up until 1966 when the cows were sold. During that time, my dad, Philip, began planting trees, which turned into the Christmas tree business. He sold the first trees in 1947. Today we sell about 15,000. As a little kid, I loved to garden, so I began to sell organic vegetables. So that began the vegetable and the fruit enterprise. It's a very strong, family-oriented operation.
Terry Jones's son, Jamie, has added a vineyard and winery operation to the farm's attractions.
You have a pumpkin, or a Christmas tree the day after either October 31st Halloween or December 24th Christmas, the value of that product plummets pretty quickly. At least the idea of bottling something, there's certainly an advantage to having a product that you can market it at a later point and not have to see it go to waste.
The Jones Winery is one of the newest additions to the state's burgeoning vineyard industry. In a successful bid to exploit the popular appeal of local wineries and the beautiful vineyard environments throughout the state, Connecticut wineries have created a cooperative brand of sorts, a wine trail tour of state vineyards.
There's 16 wineries on the wine trail currently. There's 22 licensed wineries, and there's 5 or 6 more in the process of getting licensed. It means 500,000 visitors a year, and so it really is a huge boon to our economy.
Priam Vineyard offered their first vintage for sale in 2003.
We always want to remain very hands-on, handcrafted, hand-picked, high-quality boutique winery. We want to always have our customers really know who we are and where everything's coming from.
Anyone that comes to our farm on Friday will know why it's important to protect agriculture. You have fresh vegetables, you have fresh cheese, you have fresh wine, and you're supporting open space, you're supporting local farmers. Local farmers now realize you need to get retail. What that does for us is it keeps the farm viable. And anytime you can keep a farm viable, you keep 40 or 50 houses off of it.
Direct marketing on the farm is a natural fit with the rapidly growing demand for organic food. There are 60 organic farms in the state, most of which engage in direct sales to customers. Urban Oaks Organic Farm moved from Bolton to downtown New Britain in 1999.
We are probably the only working urban farm in the country. This was the site of a former wholesale florist complex, Sandelli's, that was an anchor business in this neighborhood in the city for 75 years. The place was really a mess. We were able to salvage these greenhouses over here. So the state actually paid for the renovation of all the greenhouses. Right now we're heating these greenhouses with natural gas. It is expensive. It does work out in terms of production we get out of here. I do hope to find maybe some funding or some university that can do some research for us on alternative energy. We deliver wholesale from Hartford to Westport year-round. We do a farm stand on the weekends. We're probably one of the few places where you get people from the suburbs who are interested in specialty food mixing with people from the neighborhood who are, interested in fruits that are part of their culture.
Developing a closer relationship with customers is one rationale behind an increasingly popular marketing approach called community-supported agriculture. CSA farms sell shares in the farm's harvest, which customers pick up once a week on the farm.
Our biggest customer demographic is young families with children, and they say they want to show their kids where their food comes from, and they also want pure organic produce for their children. Holcomb Farm is a pretty unique farm in that it's not just a CSA, it's also a charitable farm. About 60% of our produce is earmarked for the CSA. The other part of what we do is we partner with social service agencies in Hartford, and we provide between 30 and 40,000 pounds of fresh produce every year. We grow about 35 different crops. I have a year-round assistant manager, and we also have 4 apprentices who work here from April through November. They do the bulk of the work.
A farm apprenticeship is one way to learn farming. With fewer family farms turning out young farmers, the question of where a new generation of farmers will come from is critical to the future of state agriculture. To help train future farmers, Connecticut established 19 regional high school agricultural centers in the 1950s. Nonawag High School's agriculture program started even earlier when state agriculture was booming.
Our program has been around since 1920 and has evolved from a handful of boys that grew up on farms to over 300 students from 20 different surrounding towns, 10 of which live on a farm. And last year we had 200 applications for 90 freshman spots. 3/4 of our kids go on to college. The curriculum has changed over the years to address the diversity of agriculture in our state. When it started, there was production agriculture. The whole curriculum was dairy farming, growing crops, et cetera. And now that's about 10% of what we do. So the majority of the students come to our program interested in related agricultural careers such as floriculture, landscaping, horse management, veterinary science, conservation, natural resources, as well as animal science. And one of the best parts of the program is our supervised agricultural experience program, the work experience part of it, that we have students work at facilities such as this greenhouse or nursery business, and they need to accumulate 200 hours in the school year outside of school. It gives them a competitive edge before they go on to college to study it further.
Like most other agricultural school graduates, Paul Bucciaglia chose a career off the farm as a plant scientist. But when he saw the growth of successful organic farms, Bucciaglia saw a way to fulfill a long-time ambition and take up farming himself. He started Fort Hill Farm in 2002 on land rented from the Nature Conservancy.
I started this farm on my life savings, and I blew it all in 3 months. And then I started maxing out credit cards, and then I asked my father for some money, and that's how I financed the farm. The reception that we've had is phenomenal. I've never advertised, and every year I've sold out our CSA program. That kind of commitment to the farm allows us to grow the wide range of crops we do. We grow 40, 50 different kinds of crops here. Farming, as small-scale farmers practice it now, is very entrepreneurial. You need to be able to identify your market, identify your production systems, set up the systems to get your product out of the field and to people in a way that you can make a profit. We could have dozens of farms like this in this state because we've got an interested population. There's a lot of demand for this. Local produce in general, organic in particular. And that's the beauty of Connecticut, where you've got local markets very close to good farmland. There's land in the state that we can use for development, but there's really just incredibly valuable pieces of agricultural land that we need to preserve. And if we don't do that, there will be no farming for the future because there's no place to do it on.
The ongoing development of farmland into housing, retail, and business uses is a key threat to the future of state agriculture. Between 1997 and 2002, the state lost more than 12% of its farmland.
In the last 5 years, for which the federal government keeps statistics, Connecticut lost a greater share of its farmland than any other state, double the percentage of a state like New Jersey, which is considered, the poster child for sprawl. We're one of the slowest growing population states in the country, but the fastest percentage loss of farmland.
Connecticut continues to lose between 7,000 and 9,000 acres of farmland on an annual basis. The state has about 360,000 acres of active farmland, with 170,000 acres of that land in crop production. If present trends continue, most of that land will be irrevocably lost to development within the next 2 decades. The Connecticut legislature recognized the significance of state agriculture more than 40 years ago.
In 1963, Connecticut was the first state to enact the concept of current use agricultural taxation, so that farmland was taxed at the local level based on its ag value, not its development value. And all 49 other states followed with similar legislation. And the farmland preservation program, which began in the mid-70s, was also one of the first.
The state's farmland preservation program focuses on the best lands for growing agricultural crops. The state pays the landowner to place a restriction in perpetuity on the property that prohibits the subdivision or development of the land for any purpose. The farmer continues to own the property and keeps the right to sell it. The program's progress has been uneven. Until 2006, it was funded solely through state bonds, which resulted in inconsistent and, in some years, non-existent funding. Meanwhile, land costs have risen dramatically, making development rights ever more costly to acquire.
We've had farmers willing to put their land into trust to sell the development rights, and yet the state has not been able to come forward with the funds in a timely manner to do that. And as a result, they've had to turn and sell off to developers. That's a tremendous loss for the state.
In order to increase farmland preservation funding, the state enacted a law in 2005 instituting a filing fee on local land transactions.
Stands for, in one bill, with one signature, we are not only preserving our heritage, but we're preserving our present and our future.
This pay-as-you-go system, a fee on land record documents that are recorded, will contribute a steady, reliable funding source each year to farmland preservation. Our goal is to have not only the stable year-to-year funding, it's also to continue with the bonding. If we can live up to both of those commitments, that could be as much as $10 million or more per year.
Buying development rights generates one-time income for property owners and makes the land available to sell at its agricultural value.
It was because of the program that we were able to get into business. We leased a farm that was operating, and then the previous owner sold the development rights to the state of Connecticut, and we were able to purchase it at its agricultural value.
Another strategic goal of the Farmland Preservation Program is making protected farmland available for rent. Rentals provide an income stream to aging farmers and an opportunity for new or established farmers to rent land at affordable rates. It's an imperfect solution, as protected farmland does not need to be actively farmed, and in fact could be bought and used as a trophy house lot with a great rural ambience.
The big problem with leasing is knowing where the land's going down the road. Producers on rented land have year-to-year questions about where they're going to be the next year, and that is a big problem in agricultural production systems.
In eastern Connecticut, about 50% of the land that farmers work is rented. In western Connecticut, that figure rises to about 90% of all working farmland. In addition to state efforts, the federal government, municipalities, and local land trusts all have programs to acquire farm development rights as well as outright purchases. These entities often partner with each other on farmland protection projects.
I'm one of 4 children. My cousin is one of 4 children. The reason that we pursued having the local land trust buy the development rights here was that it was the one way to compensate the uninvolved parties and have the place still be a farm. In order to do that, we spent probably more than 5 years working with the Simsbury Land Trust. Over $750,000 was donated by individuals in Simsbury to go toward the preservation of part of our farm. So there's strong support for that sort of thing in Simsbury.
You know, developers will always be there to take the land, but there's a lot of times it's not just the farmer fighting it now, it's the neighborhood, the town, the county.
While there is growing awareness of the value of our remaining farmland, it is not a universal sentiment, especially in some of the more highly suburbanized towns. Farms are sometimes odoriferous. Tractors sometimes slow down traffic. Many towns, though, continue to value farming as an integral part of their identity and their economy. But local zoning rules and a dependence on property tax revenues to support town services and schools can lead to a dependence on subdivisions and business developments that often rise up on irreplaceable farmland.
Ellington has been historically one of the prime agricultural towns in the state. So our transition to a suburban area has been only in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's been a real shock to the system because farming was the primary industry in town, and it's under assault. We're producing some very upscale housing right now. $400,000 and $500,000 is the going rate for a house in this town. And that just stuns everyone who lives here or has lived here for any length of time. I think farms are valuable on a variety of levels, not only just the aesthetic pieces of the puzzle, but as a working manufacturer. Agriculture provides, more product than it consumes. It takes an acre of land to feed 1 cow for 1 year. In a housing development, 1 acre is 1 house is 2 kids. 2 kids cost us $16,000 a year to educate, and I haven't plowed the road yet. Something's either growing or it's dying, and I think we need to reinvest in our farmers and our farmland.
Paradoxically, 2 cherished aspects of our heritage have collided to create the pressures now threatening state farmland. Town primacy and the resulting weak state oversight of development is a core reason for sprawl. And sprawl is a core reason that we are at risk of losing our farming heritage.
We need to move to more creative development strategies. I mean, they had this figured out 150 years ago. You concentrate your factories, your business centers, you locate it near those hubs for transportation. At the time, it was either on a river or the railroads coming in. Today would be major interstate connections, but we need to revitalize those rail connections for both passenger and freight. If we do that, then it's much easier to have the sensible kind of development that will preserve farmland and open space with less pressure from sprawl and pushing our development into rural areas.
Protecting existing farmland, nurturing new farmers, and strong state development policies will all help to protect Connecticut's agricultural industry and heritage. But the challenge doesn't end there. The success of Connecticut farming is also influenced by federal policies that favor large factory farms and regional commodity specialization. These policies, along with inexpensive food flown in from around the world, create intense competition and pricing pressures for state farmers. Furthermore, with each state farm that disappears, there is one less customer for the state's already diminished agriculture infrastructure. Fewer equipment dealers, feed stores, slaughterhouses, and veterinarians, making farm supplies and services more expensive and difficult to secure.
The problem is there's no easy solution to saving, in quotes,
agriculture. If you can't pay your bills, it doesn't make much difference who owns the development rights. Eventually, the farm is going to have to cease operation. Giving the farm a big chunk of money for development rights merely postpones that date.
With many farmers operating on an uncertain land base, often struggling to make a profit, is it possible that this extraordinary part of our state heritage is fading into history? Or are we in the midst of another transformation of Connecticut agriculture, with niche farms flourishing alongside more traditional operations? With transportation costs skyrocketing for food brought in from out of state, and with a heightened concern for disease or terrorism that could affect the long-distance food system, many observers see increased opportunities for local agriculture. But the viability of Connecticut farming depends on its land base, and that base continues to disappear at an alarming rate.
The average acquisition throughout the state historically has been about $3,000 an acre. Land values are quite expensive in Connecticut, and they've been going up every day, so the price continually gets more and more expensive. What can be done needs to be done within the next 10 or 20 years, or in some communities, it's too late already.
Since 1978, 220 farms and 31,000 acres of farmland have been protected from development, or about 1,100 acres protected each year. The recent increase in state funding for farmland preservation is just a start. Recent projections independently undertaken by two agricultural sector stakeholders estimate that to save just half of the existing base of farmland within the next 15 years will take about $900 million, or $45 million a year more than current projected funding levels. Given the current rate of development of farmland, to do less could mean that the state's agricultural industry would have to operate on just 1/3 of the land base that it now has. If we can protect the agricultural land base, make it available to farmers, and create support programs to help farming be profitable, it is likely that new generations of farmers will want to work the land. Jamaican native Michael Buchanan started farming in Connecticut in 2004.
There are populations out there that are looking out for products of their own ethnic origins, as well as others who like the exotics. Most of my crops are sold in the greater Hartford area, where there's a large Jamaican Caribbean population. It's not quite full-time in the season, but I'm heading there. It's challenging. I'd say I broke even. The main thing is to be able to produce what you can with what you have, and to work with your challenges, your environment, to focus on the markets you want and that are receptive to you. That's basically it.
The last few decades have demonstrated the durability and imagination of Connecticut's remaining farmers as they adapted to changing market conditions and the state's suburban lifestyle. But sprawl and the challenge of making a living at farming are difficult forces that require a proportionate response. The alternative is the loss of one of the state's most diverse and productive industries and a Connecticut landscape essentially stripped of our rich agricultural heritage.
Our farms and all that they contribute environmentally and food-wise, we better take care of it. What we treasure in Connecticut is our sense of community, preserving our past, but also investing in our future. We really owe it to our children and their children to provide them with the same quality of life opportunities that we've had. Shame on us if we squander that.
I am Connecticut grown, from seed that's Connecticut sown. If it's veggies at a roadside stand or where I pick my own, when I can I buy Connecticut grown. It's in my blood to live off the land, with dairy farmers here and back in Ireland. Though I've left the fields behind me and a stage is where I stand, my roots are still tied to the land. I am Connecticut grown, from seed that's Connecticut sown. If it's veggies at a roadside stand or where I pick my own, when I can I buy Connecticut grown. There's no place like a nursery when I'm gardening or sprucing up my property. And while chopping down our Christmas tree, my son and I agree, a tree farm is the place to be. I am Connecticut grown, from seed that's Connecticut sown. If it's veggies at a roadside stand or where I pick my own, when I can I buy Connecticut grown. In October dressed in orange and black, I head out to a farm stand that has a pumpkin patch. Then I'll carve the biggest jack-o'-lantern you have ever seen to scare away the spooks on Halloween. I am Connecticut grown, from seed that's Connecticut sown. If it's veggies at a roadside stand or where I pick my own, when I can I buy Connecticut grown. If it's honey apple cider or ice cream in a cone, when I can I buy Connecticut grown.
Cover them up. Good job. That's good.